Sure, absolutely. We have this very, I would ask questions, but I didn't go. But that's not what I'm going to do.
For a while since I got to see you.
So sad.
I build a computer every night with like it's like one of those things that's like huge achievement for 16-year-old. Of course, my parents would all got lost.
Hey,
I'm Lori.
I'm Novi-san. All the diehards are here. Yay. Thanks for coming back. We saved the best for last.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us this long but really, really, really interesting day. I'm always very selfish about how I kind of assess how our conferences go, and the question I ask is, am I learning something and am I entertained? And boy, both those things are true in spades today. My name is Paul Ohm. I'm one of the co-directors of Silicon Flatirons. Brad started the day by talking about the boundary jumping nature of this conference, and I represent a different piece of that. I lead our information technology and intellectual property part of Silicon Flatirons, which generally means I focus a lot on internet privacy, which is kind of my area of scholarly focus. I'm also a person who has spent some time in the government. So having listened to that last panel, I think I need to kind of be confessional and admit that at the outset. Let me tell you one of the ground rules of how we're going to do this panel. It's a little different than how I usually do panels. We were supposed to be joined here by our colleague Scott Peppett, who was going to play the measured, nuanced moderator, and I would have been free to like mix it up and be a partisan. When Scott got pulled away, I said, I am not going to relinquish that. So today I am not the impartial moderator, and in fact, I'm going to do my darndest to be really partial. In fact, I think the kind of thing I wrote on my notes before coming here was, my job is to harsh your mellow, because some of what I focus on and think about, I think, runs smack into some of the themes that have been raised today, and I think privacy tends to do that when we talk about technology. But before I go on, same format, we're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then open it up to the audience. Let me introduce, or reintroduce in one case, this wonderful panel that's up here to discuss this with me. Lori Emerson is an assistant professor here at CU in the Department of English, and one thing that she has kind of contributed to the day is this media archaeology lab that we'll talk a little bit about, where she has a museum essentially of old, outdated technology, and you have some in the next room, right?
I do,
What
yeah.
are we displaying?
I have a Vectrex gaming console there that's from 1983,
Yeah.
an Altair that Brad Feld donated actually from '76, one laptop per child, and a digital Etch-a-Sketch from 1986.
Dan, you know and know well, and it's been really, really wonderful to kind of get to hear more about this fascinating MIT class that he's been leading. And then Marcus Thomas at the end, the Chief Technology Officer at Subsentio. Marcus and I have a little history. The last time we met, it was probably maybe at FBI headquarters when he was an assistant director and I was a trial attorney in the computer crime section of the Justice Department. We often say that we're not going to do long introductions. Instead, we're going to refer you to the biographies in the program. If you haven't done this yet, can you please look at Marcus Thomas's biography? Because there are words in there we have never, ever put in a Silicon Flatirons biography. Let me read some to you. Friendly force tracking, surreptitious entry, counter encryption. This isn't your usual list of programming languages that Marcus knows. And the theme of our panel, our unmoderated, heavily biased panel, Brad said is really the kind of subtitle for today, is resistance futile? And so I very much am kind of the opinion that radical shifts in technology are the kind that have mostly been celebrated today and are the kind that kind of have shown up in science fiction for a long time. Some of these have had the negative repercussion of impacting our personal privacy. And that in some ways, individuals are either being harmed today or at risk of being harmed today by the actions of the government, but also by the actions of private corporations. So consider that my kind of thesis statement for where I'm coming to you today, and we can talk more about this. And of course, we don't want to lose our eye on the role science fiction plays in all of this. So here's kind of my first question, and maybe I'll start with Marcus here. I feel badly for kind of science fiction authors today, like some of the ones we've had join us, because here's a novel that I've got in my head, and like everyone else, I want to write a science fiction novel. So there's a kind of gaunt, slight, pale man of ambiguous ethnicity who lives in a Norwegian country and encourages whistleblowers to mail him documents that he can then post on a distributed network around the world, thereby evading prosecution and other laws. Meanwhile, there's another slight, gaunt, but slightly more colored individual who takes a surreptitious job as a government contractor with a national security agency with the secret ulterior motive, perhaps abetted by a team of journalists, that he's going to steal a bunch of documents and then release them to the world. There's this cryptocurrency that's kind of beginning to question the underpinnings of markets. There's this shadowy government agency that is paying companies millions of dollars to put in bad encryption. And I know what you're all thinking. This is crazy. This will never sell, because none of this is realistic at all. So Marcus, I guess the question for you is truth stranger than fiction? I mean, we're living in a science fiction novel, aren't we? And of course, you've got a top secret clearance, so you've got to answer this question kind of differently than the rest of us. But what do you think? I mean,
truth's stranger than fiction, but truth's not really constrained by the story. We talked about, let me get this down a little bit. We talked about the thread or the story that kind of hold things together, and truth doesn't really constrain itself. It's kind of under the control of individuals acting on their own interest. And I think that's a big part of the issue here, is that this whole thing is a system, and everybody acts in their own interest. And entrepreneurs are acting in very objective interest to produce products for typically money making, but maybe to better the world a little bit. Science fiction writers are acting in their own interest, and some are artistic, some are monetary. Government employees, I won't say government because that's a thing that I don't know exactly what it is, but government employees are rewarded for acting the way they act, so they act in their own interest. When you pile all these interests together, the outcome is kind of unpredictable and mysterious. And I think, when we tell history, we don't actually tell what happened exactly. We tell a story that helps to frame history in a context that will help us looking forward. And I think the same thing happens when you tell science fiction. It has to make sense so that it's a framework that helps you interpret the future or the present and going forward. What really happens in real life is kind of a mishmash.
And is the trend accelerating? I mean, you and I were kind of in government at the same time, although you served a lot longer than I did. We talk about kind of accelerating curves in innovation and entrepreneurship. Is it accelerating too when it comes to this world of privacy and surveillance? Is that your impression?
Yeah, I definitely think it's accelerating. When you think about it, if someone asks you to create a device that as soon as you created it, it might go crazy and kill you, you'd think twice about it, and you'd particularly think about putting some safety kill switch or something on it. And you really wouldn't give it to your kids or really sell it to anybody because you'd feel like some ethical responsibility. But if you told them, look, I'm going to make a device that will track you everywhere you go, keep track of every conversation you have, pretty much of importance, detail exactly who you interact with, including those conversations you'd like to keep very private from your wife, your children, your boss, whatever. I want to create this device, and somebody gets access to it, all that stuff could come out. Yep. For the most part, society thinks nothing of creating that device and giving 100 billion copies out of it. So a lot of this is about, thinking up front in technology about the consequences and applying, rational principles to the development and deployment of these kinds of things. And, that's very, very hard to do now compared to 20 years ago because now things move so fast. We pretty much could catch up 20 years ago if we made a mistake. Now things get out there and try to go recover and make them, as a society and correct them. It's very hard.
So same question to Dan and Lori, but kind of as educators, I also am curious about generational kind of looks at this truth is stranger than fiction. Dan, did you ever run into in your class the idea that people were less impressed by the science fiction because the New York Times front page was...
Oh, definitely. I said earlier, teaching neuromancer to anyone born like after 1990, they're not impressed. I mean, everything in there has sort of come to pass in one way or another. He described the internet, he created cyberspace. There's all sorts of stuff, and they just kind of go, I have that. And there's a couple things that haven't been done, thankfully, like the meat puppet. But it's really not. For us, we go back and we read it and we remember how prophetic it was and how deeply, moving for us it was. And, for sort of, you have to sort of point out that these things didn't exist to a student. But last Monday on our panel at South by, Warren Ellis said that, given everyone's carrying a small bit of computation and communication on them almost at all times with enough processing for several thousand moon landings at any one time, and all of our media, like science fiction television shows, movies, like science fiction has become the ambient noise of our society that we actually live in. And then Bruce Sterling jumped in and said, yes, but it's become this Walmart science fiction, right? This idea that everything's pre-pressed, pre-processed, you get it, it comes into your house, it gets set up, and it's really not this sort of moonshotty big ideas kind of thing. And then the privacy thing is in there too, because we've given everyone these devices that you say, and at the same time, we've allowed them to make us into a product. Our information, our location, what we're doing, what we're thinking, where we're eating, what we're taking pictures of, we are just feeding the machine, as they said earlier. And that's really important. A lot of people don't realize that when they're using these free services, that they are the product.
Yeah, no, and I'll get back to that theme, and both of you raised that, but let me give Lori a chance on this kind of first theme, the truth is stranger than fiction. We should clarify that your field isn't science fiction.
No, I don't do anything to do with science fiction, but I do weird media. I think that's how I would describe it, or anything weird.
Yeah.
So I teach an Intro to Digital Media for Humanities, where I'm teaching a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and I really see my job as to frighten them and to make them really paranoid. You should laugh, but I'm actually totally serious. They know they're being tracked. They know they're being surveilled, but they don't care. And that really bothers me because I think they should care, to be honest, because I think that having a private space allows them to imagine what could be possible or imagine the otherwise. And privacy is the one space where value cannot be extracted. And they have no experience of that whatsoever.
Wait, that's a profound statement, but I want you to unpack that. Privacy is the one space where value is extracted from privacy all the time, isn't it? Or what
I mean, your private space. That's what I mean.
I see.
So there is this book that just came out that I'm really obsessed by. It's called 24/7 by Jonathan Crary. And it's about how our sleep is being invaded. But it has a lot to do with privacy. And he just talks about how sleep is the last frontier of the untouched, And
Right.
I think privacy is the same.
So are you saying is the space or should be the space?
Well, should be.
Okay. I thought you were speaking kind of descriptively, and there are lots of entrepreneurs who would disagree. Oh, no, we're going to invade privacy all we want. You're talking normatively, like we should choose to draw a line around this thing we call privacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And my students are happily saying, I don't care about my privacy, I have nothing to hide. And I try to explain to them, it's not necessarily that you need to hide what you ate for breakfast, it's the larger.
All right, so here's the thing. I'm going to do my best to continue to tie this into science fiction, but the privacy scholar in me can't help but probe this thing we've just opened, and partly because I think we're going to end up disagreeing, at least I will, with some of what the last panel had to say about all this. So Marcus said society decides to embrace these technologies, and then Dan and Lori kind of said similar things. Lori's was more about the younger generation. How are we deciding this? Like, was there a public meeting where we all got together and talked about this, and we said, here's the privacy value, here's the kind of economic value on the other end, here's the social value of all of these wonderful tools, or are we just talking about kind of base market transactions and economic efficiency, right? And obviously it's a slanted question, but has privacy as a value been part of that conversation, or has it more been the invisible hand, right? What do you think? I mean, again, maybe it's too slanted a question, and I'm fishing for an answer.
Well, if you remember in the very early days of the internet, there wasn't anybody really ever coming together and creating standards. It was a really loose consortium of people creating sort of pseudo-standards and then agreeing to use that. Right. There were no standards body, but they got it up and working and we had an internet. Yeah. And then people started talking about like, oh, privacy. Oh, yeah, maybe we should do something about that. Right. And that happens anytime you try to graft privacy on after. Anytime you don't go in and say, let's encrypt from bit 1, you're going to get that sort of, you're always going to be chasing the tail because you've already let the genie out of the bottle, and you're trying to continually stamp out whatever new fire in privacy pops up. So you've got to actually go at it from the very beginning.
But why, again, and I keep pushing on the same word, should, because at the end of the day, you think that's better for society, right? Who was it? It was John on the last panel said something really interesting, which was ethics is a choice, and some companies choose it. And when they choose it, it could actually turn out to be a wonderful, he called it, I wrote it down, the aesthetics of ethics. But I think the kind of unstated reverse of that is, but it's perfectly legitimate to choose not to care about ethics, or interestingly, to choose to be anti-ethical, because you might be able to arbitrage some opportunity because other companies won't cross the line you cross, right? Now, is John still in the room? I think that's what I heard him saying. Please forgive me if I've kind of butchered it. Not the last part. The last part about anti and arbitrage I made up, right? So is that, Dan, you kind of suggested that, I don't know. What do you think about that? I mean, is ethics a choice for a startup?
Yes, I think whether you're a startup or a human being, you always have the choice to act ethically.
Yeah.
And the name of the panel is resistance futile. Right. And I would say no, resistance is never futile because you don't know when you're going to spark a revolution. Right. So it may be futile for you because they may take you away, but seeing you get dragged out may start something happening or make somebody more aware that they need to be more careful. Right. So it's not a question of, And
I'm not trying to be too glib, and honestly, when we get to Q&A, if someone wants to just stand up and give the opposite viewpoint, if we're not representing it, please do so as well. But Marcus, from the government's point of view, right, and the government got beaten up a lot on the last panel, is the ethics of surveillance a choice, right? Or if not, why not? Why is it, a different question?
I would have a little subtle difference in the answer. Yes, individuals can choose whether they want to be ethical or not, to a limit, to a point. Right. The reality is society, imposes certain limits on us as to how unethical we can be. I have to leash my dogs when I take them for a walk. I'm perfectly okay with letting my dogs run wild.
Dog leash laws are very controversial.
Right. Well,
go on. Yeah.
In my part of Virginia, I'm very comfortable with letting my dogs run loose, but I understand the society's interest in that limitation. So I can choose to be unethical, but I can pay a price for it too. Mm-hmm. So you end up with these, there's choices to be made within the box you can live in. Yeah. Many people cross outside the box and get away with it, but the reality is, government's kind of role as one of many roles, acting on behalf of society, is to keep those boxes, edges kind of as sure as they can. So, yeah, individually you have choices, but as a society you have responsibilities. That question about ethics and responsibility, I'm kind of in agreement with the earlier panel on that. Yeah, individuals may not have a responsibility. Science fiction writers may not have a responsibility to people. They're artists. Entrepreneurs are trying to create new things. They're artists in a way. But society has a responsibility. If we choose to keep something and we want to keep it, we have a responsibility to keep it. And working together, it's 200, 300 million of us in America. It's not real easy to come to consensus. But we do have a responsibility if we want to keep our things stable or take it in a certain course, to set limits and set rules and enforce those rules, police those rules. There's nothing inherently good or bad about that. It just is the mechanism we have to do it.
So, and then with individuals, are you lumping in their corporations as well and people selling products to individuals? Again, ethical or not ethical? Again,
you can choose, but there's certainly due care and concepts like that in law that require you can't sell poison to someone and tell them it's food. There's limits to what we as a society have chosen are the limit. And it's kind of ambiguous in areas, euthanasia and all kinds of.
Well, even privacy. I want to be clear. I'm not
even
saying privacy is this black and white and we all agree on what the rules are. In fact, I think the opposite. It's highly contested and really interesting, and that's why I spend all my time thinking about it.
Well, I worked my whole career, and I still work in the area of helping in the legal intrusion of privacy. The legal intercept.
You got to be careful with your pronunciation. I heard illegal.
No, legal.
Legal.
Yeah. But lawful, whatever you want to. I say lawful. It sounds a little better. But I've always been a pro-privacy advocate. I always had intense interest in keeping my own private life and my children, my family, and things. So I'm, and I don't know many people in government who aren't that way. So, but what happens, I think I saw in this last 12 years or so, post 9/11, particularly, you had an event so catastrophic, so powerful to the brain, the collective brain of the country, that it created this moment where you have a major shift, and we shifted very rapidly away from privacy towards security in a very, at the time, important, maybe even necessary way.
Were you at the Bureau
I was, yes.
On September 11th?
Yes.
Right?
And I watched it from within government, and I know many skeptics even in government that watched it. I mean, it became really bad inside government, outside government, anytime to speak at all against security. I mean, we have nationalism, we have security, we have all these issues floating because we're at war, we're a country at war. We still sing God Bless America in the middle of ball games. I mean, we are still hung up a bit with this event. It was taboo to even imagine the concept that as a society we might be willing to bear another 9/11 to get back some privacy. Couldn't even say such things. Still dangerous to say. So, what am I saying? Well, I'm saying at moments like that, there's this extreme propensity to shift radically one way or the other. And that's kind of where I think having principles and holding to those principles are critically important. Ari talks about that storyline. You need a storyline that helps you anchor society on every side of the issue to some basic thread that flows through there. It includes security as an important aspect of our life. It includes privacy as an important aspect of our life. And it shouldn't swing too far either way, in my opinion.
And privacy and security don't need to be an either or. There's, we don't have to make it binary. You have to, the challenge of innovation is to be able to have the security while still maintaining privacy and civil liberties. It's an innovation issue.
So there was this New York Times blog post, and again, Dan, and Marcus too, there are innovators and entrepreneurs on the panel, but I'd also like to hear from the audience on this. So this blog post 2 weeks ago that said, startups just never invest in security, or at least they always underinvest in security. It's not what draws the investment, it's not what draws the consumer base, and sure, they're gambling a little bit with the big breach that'll kind of be bad headlines, but even then companies have recovered from those bad headlines, so it's a risk kind of worth taking. Does this ring true with...
Yeah, it's very hard. There's a very Frankenstein moment when you're creating something where you want to see your creature live, and you haven't given the full thought on what it's going to do once it wakes up. And that's the moment, where it's groaning and sitting up and starting to run amok, and you're like, oh wow, I put a kill switch in there, huh? So, and that's what Mary Shelley, the entire point, is warning us. It's like, don't play God, don't create, basically what is a child that you're not going to take care of. But that urge to see your new startup, get that product out there, or that new app being deployed, across phones, is that you've got to say, whoa, let me think about this before it's run amok. Let me actually start putting in safety, privacy, precautions, those kind of things. But it's very easy to just say, I got to get it built by tomorrow. There's a demo.
So I will say, so for those of us in the kind of very boring world of privacy policy as it's practiced in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, kind of the watchword for the last 5 years, and I've hated this, has been privacy by design. And so the theory is privacy is only discussed late in the company's lifespan when it has a full panoply of people, including a chief privacy officer. And by the way, this conversation, privacy by design, means you don't only do it in the C-suite, but you do it throughout your entire company down to the line coder who's deciding that day whether or not to fill the buffer or not fill the buffer with the user input and how long to store it and where to put it. And to me, first of all, it's been hopelessly vague, but secondly, it's been a little bit of fantasy land I love the earlier quote, science fiction, it might have been you, is ethics training for engineers, right? Engineers typically don't get a ton of ethics training. Maybe it should be considered a little embarrassing that lawyers are all obligated to have 3 credit hours of ethics training and computer scientists are not. Is this a solution that's viable? Like for anyone with kind of coding background or company building background, you say to your first hire on the first day, by the way, we practice privacy by design as a company. Does that make sense? Will they know what to do with that?
I think it's nice to give lip service to, but it's really hard to actually pull off in the real world when you have to ship in a week. Yeah. There's a lot of those privacy concerns that are going to be like, well, we'll just deal with that in a little while. But, at least somebody is talking about it, thinking about it. There's a title for it. That at least means somebody is going to, put something into place, ideally.
So Lori, connecting this back to authors, and we talked, I think the Mary Shelley reference is a nice one, right? Are authors constrained by any of these kind of ethical concerns we're talking about, especially when you're talking about, and again, maybe outside a little bit, your research a little bit, authors who are kind of imagining future worlds, right? Is it considered verboten in some way to kind of depict something that's going to give someone a bad idea? I'm guessing the answer is no. We live in a free society. We have the First Amendment. But I don't mean from the government's point of view. I mean kind of from among the community of scholars. What's the take on this? I'm coming from a big point of ignorance here on this. I apologize. So if the question doesn't make sense.
No, it's okay. Well, maybe I'll just say that I've been thinking today, listening to other people talk, that it seems like in the past the role of artists, writers, science fiction writers has been to continually disrupt, and then the mainstream co-opts it, and then you disrupt, and then it gets co-opted again. So that now, actually, I think that this saying is truth stranger than fiction. Yeah. I think that it's truth. It's the real world that's continually co-opting its own disruptions, so that fiction, in a way, cannot keep up with the disruption that's going on in the real world, if you know what I mean.
So maybe authors should shift to stop writing sci-fi and just write really bland pastoral novels about people who don't
description,
do much, right?
Pure description.
to remind us of what life once was like. Okay, that's great. So Marcus, I think you might have, well, no, you really did address the government surveillance question, but let me kind of try and complexify it a little bit. So I've written an article in the Mississippi Law Journal called The Fourth Amendment in a World Without Privacy. The Fourth Amendment, of course, the right against unreasonable search and seizure. And the argument I make in the article is, and it's science fiction, I write science fiction, but I call them law review articles, is in 10 years, the FBI will no longer do its own surveillance. That it just won't make sense economically, and instead they will have implicitly kind of given that all out to this kind of massive team of subcontractors known as Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Axiom and Level 3 here in Colorado, and that the FBI agent will now be someone sitting in their lab in a lab coat hitting Control-R every couple of seconds to see what private industry has created and generated for them. And so is this premise even partly right? You're one of the best people in the world to ask this question. But then number two, a lot of the reaction to the NSA Snowden stuff has been, we've got to restrain the government, we've got to restrain the government. Very little discussion, there's been some, very little discussion has been, we have to convince companies to stop saving so much and collecting so much because it's very porous, the wall between companies and government. So that's two big questions. I mean, take them in either order. What do you think about those two notions?
Well, I think your idea of the future is probably a little off, in my opinion. A lot of the people the FBI investigates are off the grid. They're not actually heavy users of the Facebook.
Really?
You know. Well, believe it or not, there are people who intentionally take extreme efforts and costs to obscure their identity or their presence or their movements or their activities. So there'll always be a place for digging beyond what you can just order from a database or that sort of thing. More and more they do. I think we'll be relying on what's available out there, what people are keeping. I heard somebody talked about the possible implant that keep track of everything you ever seen, everything you ever been. I'm like, wow, that'd be great for them. Plug into that thing.
Just a function called deposition, and just
right.
I have my deposition. There it is.
But so I don't see the future being able to kind of do away with the need, because as the amounts of information just explode, the sources explode, and there's going to always be plenty of niches to keep people busy trying to find the piece of information that you can't just go to Facebook or Google or someone else and get. But it is getting easier, I think, to find basic information.
I think part of the premise of this future that you're talking about talks to the second tenet of the great nerd religion. So the first one is the singularity, and that's the rapture of the nerds. Everything is going to be wonderful and happy, and we won't have bodies anymore, and we'll exist in this continuum. And the second one is this strange idea that if you just put enough data together, patterns will magically emerge, and you'll be able to notice and see things that you never were able to see before, and that they'll be like self-emergent. And so this idea that you're just going to keep piling on the amount of data, getting it from Google, getting it from whatever, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, you still need to have a human being saying, what are we looking for? And you have to parse a lot of data. And you can train things to look for it, but you have to know what you're looking for. This fully formed, like, oh, here's a terrorist attack that we couldn't possibly have conceived because there are 8 or 9 other features that just magically generated it. That's not going to happen.
Hey, man, I saw it on TV.
Yeah, I mean, talk about fiction, right? I mean, I've been in a lot of government labs and government kind of surveillance centers. They never look like 24, and they never look like Homeland. It's kind of amazing. And I always watch this stuff saying, God, that would have been nice.
Hiring the wrong designers.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all it is.
Yeah, but that's the statement you said, I think, is absolutely true. And in fact, I've made a little cottage career of being the one guy who will say really bad things about Google flu trends, which is usually held up as the kind of paragon of why we should break privacy promises to our consumers because we're going to cure the plague. It turns out, no, what we're going to do is we're going to get a bunch of Google engineers a really nice publication, but that's about all they did with flu trends. And it turns out they're wrong more often than they're right. But that's a different question than, is every person who is ever the head of the NSA going to ask for more data, right? Or for that matter, is every Google engineer who's in charge of doing whatever big data project they have going to ask for more data? And I think the answer to the second question is, of course they are.
They're going to ask if they can get it.
Yeah.
But you have to educate them and say, why do you need it?
But in the NSA's case, the answer almost always is going to be, yeah, you can get it. We're not sure you need it, but you can get it, right? So why that disconnect? Why do the people in charge want more data if you just made an aggressive argument that they don't need more data?
I'm going to let you answer that one.
Well, again, I think people act the way they feel they're rewarded to act. Bottom line, and accountability is everything. So you lay out what your expectations are as policy, either be president's policy or society's policy passed through laws or whatever we happen to do. You lay these out, and if you require them to be thoughtful about those policies by accountability, then you produce policy that works in the way you want it to work. If you don't require them to be thoughtful about it, it's lip service and it doesn't work. And somebody mentioned television. We've talked a lot about fiction today. We haven't talked much about motifs or tropes. It's okay for fiction writers to use tropes to kind of move the narrative along, and they use them a lot. And television uses them to the point that they just become formulaic. And that can happen in public policy, I think. When you start doing things and passing laws and moving issues around and you don't pay attention to the principle of privacy, and you just use some tried and true motif to push policy along, or pass massive budget changes to give people the money to do things. Without that thoughtfulness, then you create formulaic outcomes, and they tend to slide towards less privacy, I think.
I wonder if one of the underlying things that we're really talking about is sort of the cult of science. Like science and data is just magically inherently awesome and good, and then you have ethics as something on the other side. But I wonder if actually what we're talking about is just humanist interpretation. We're sort of making an argument, I think, for just the value of arts and humanities in general and the power it has to interpret, which could have ethical consequences or not. But it's the necessary counterpoint to the science data business going on.
My former student, Mike Boucher, in the last panel asked the people whether that's all just kind of silly stuff, right? We're kind of post-human now. No, but I agree with you. I mean, one other thing I've said is, and it's interesting, you go through Silicon Valley and it's hard to find a statistician anymore. because they all got new business cards in the last 18 months that says data scientist. And so whenever I'm trying to score points in a big data debate, I'll say, how many data humanists have you met? Probably none, right? Because this is all about science, and who could possibly oppose science, right? I mean, you're essentially evil in our society if you have anything bad to say about science. Okay, so Lori, let me kind of then ask a question about the core thing that brings you here today, which is your really deep investigation into the history of computing technology.
Yeah.
Right? And so maybe let me give you an opportunity to spend a minute or two just telling us like where that interest came from. You know, is there a place where we can go and fondle an Apple IIe? Because it's been a long time. Sorry, that sounds worse than it but then bringing it back to the panel, I mean, is there anything in there, like in your studies, that tell you about kind of design and social values and things like that?
Oh,
and
yeah.
Humanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the story of how the lab came to be is that interesting. There's a Canadian experimental poet. His name is B.P. Nicol. He wrote one of the first digital poems on an Apple IIe. And I had the idea back in 2008 or 2009 to get a lab full of Apple IIes and get this poem on 5 1/4-inch floppies and have my classes go in there. And that's all they would do is play with this work and fiddle with Apple IIes. Since then...
Wait, did you do this? You actually did that?
I did do that, yeah.
How much does an Apple IIe cost on the market?
Not very much.
Really?
Yeah, top secret, but they're pretty cheap.
Oh, God, okay.
Yeah.
I know what I'm doing tonight. Yeah.
Like $100.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But since then, the lab has really evolved, and I've used it as a tool to really trouble our notions of history. Like Brad says, he doesn't find history interesting. I think a particular way that history is practiced is not interesting. And the way I'm interested in history is how we construct it, usually to tell stories of technological progress and about how everything is constantly improving and that new is better, faster is better. But I think the Media Archaeology Lab provides a really powerful argument for how that's not necessarily the case at all. I mean, if fast is your only criteria for better, then I guess the lab isn't very compelling. But you know, like the Vectrex out in the lobby uses a light pen, and you can create animations on that machine from 1983 faster and easier and more intuitively than I think you can with Flash or HTML5 or anything else. So I just think the whole way we invoke the notion of technological progress is really problematic. And that's partly what the lab is there for, is to...
Do you have failed technology? I mean, do you have a PC Junior or a Lisa? Or?
Yeah, we have an Apple Lisa.
Yeah?
We have two. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. I think the Vectrex is a piece of failed technology. It was only produced for 1 year.
Yeah. No, so that's fascinating. But I mean, it does dovetail with the thought I kept having in the last panel, which was, so if ethics isn't an obligation of the startup entrepreneur, and if it certainly isn't kind of humanism at large, what is it? Like, what's the prerogative? What's the obligation of the entrepreneur? I think the answer is efficiency measured in different ways, and wealth, like wealth creation for some people, right? Economic kind of prosperity for some people. And then I think it's also, and again, this is all provocations to get you guys to yell at me during Q&A. I think it's also to a large extent seamlessness, right? Frictionlessness is the kind of term you hear a lot more these days. You know, don't stop to ask someone if I can do this with their data, because that ruins the experience, right? You know, and so it sounds to me like that's kind of what you're playing with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I really have a problem with it. I'm sure the whole audience is going to hate my guts now.
No.
But I really have
they'll
a problem
direct it all.
with seamlessness, with the use of natural and intuitive, and even human. We've all been talking about the human. But what's the human? I mean, my experience with a computer is probably totally different than yours. Not to mention, you know, there's different, you know, with multi-touch design or gesture-based interfaces, gestures are totally different for different cultures and different people and different parts of the world. So for me, these words like natural, intuitive, user-friendly, seamless, all gloss over all that complexity in the service of a very particular notion of a human.
What do you guys think about that? I mean, is this anything you've...
I think good art is hard, and it should be hard, and it should cause friction. It should cause you to stop for a moment from your seamless experience of moving through the gallery, listening to the little chatterbox about what it's about. And it should really overwhelm you. And you should have this friction state where you're forced to look at the art and interpret the art and really think about what it means to you and as a society. We over the last couple of years at the Media Lab, we've had several faculty either pass away or retire, and we'd become very, very engineering heavy. And we just hired several people more towards the design aspect. And one of them is a guy named Kevin Slavin, who does these really big games, big urban games. And he said specifically on his opening day is, I'm here to cause friction. It's going to be my job to get you guys to get out of this like, quick, ship it, quick, make it compile, get it out the door, make it easy, make it, it's like I'm the one that's going to step in and go, whoa, is that helping? Is that helping humanity? Is that helping? And his group is called Playful Systems. And games are something that are really good. That's sort of, they're games, there are really no benefit to playing games. They're just fun. And they're a way of stepping, again, out of that slipstream, very fast, frictionless kind of efficiency that you're going for. I mean, golf would be stupid if you just walked over and dropped it in the hole, right? The whole point is we make it hard on ourselves by trying to hit it with a stick, right? And we call that fun. I don't call that fun. That's okay. And that's a way of adding friction, which adds value. So efficiency isn't always the best choice.
Marcus? The government wants frictionless access to the systems that you're helping kind of design, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't say the government expects frictionless. You remember, government's made up of people too that have the same concerns and interests and fears of everybody else. Maybe slightly different because everybody's different, but I would say innovation starts with the kind of the new thing, and we talked about science fiction starting with this idea. That should be pretty free and open. I mean, it should be provocative, or could be. It doesn't have to be, but it could be very provocative. No rules. But that's a good idea, and as you bring a good idea to a good plan, you start to shrink what it rationally ought to be, or what a society ought to allow it to be, because it starts just to be a wild idea, be it in innovation within industry or just an idea for a science fiction novel. But as it starts to affect other people, particularly other people, but then many other people, we start to layer these limits on it to protect society. And it's society's choice, no one individual. So, you start to bring it down, bring it down, bring it down. So as long as you understand there's a pathway from good idea to good plan, to implementation, to a product or a written work, a published work, yeah, we're going to get some constraint from a lot of different areas. One, from society through public policy, through law, through civil processes as well. We can't defame people. We can't slander people. There's all these sorts of things that require us to bring that funnel down. But in that innovation stage, I see it being wide open, so you really play with ideas and think about how they might impact.
So I started the panel by saying I was going to be active. And then I realized I did this weird thing throughout the panel, which was I kept promising that you're going to hate us and disagree with us and ask hard questions. I might be wrong. So I really do want to hear some of your questions. I've got 10 others if you don't have any, but I see lots of... Oh, let's invoke the wiser role. I'm not seeing a lot of students. I'm not a student anymore.
Friday.
I guess.
Friday at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, back here.
So what, in terms of technology, are you the most afraid of, whether it's something that is out now or that you see coming in the next 2 to 5 years?
Who wants to take that first? I've got an answer, but I want to hold my fire for a second.
For me, it's anything that markets itself as sensing things for me. I really have a problem with that. So I guess it's a lot of wearable tech probably really bothers me, because there's no way for me to intervene. I don't need things to sense things for me, or I need to know how they're sensing things for me and how they're filtering my experience of the world.
I have a lot of people that love Google Now, and I find Google Now to be a little problematic. When I'm walking down the street and it starts going, you like Starbucks, it starts letting me know that, because it feels it knows me well enough that it can precog, it can, cause suggestions, it can, and sure, that's, it's great to be reminded about my flight coming up and I should probably leave for the airport. That's the useful part, but it's the other stuff where it really does think it knows me. I find that problematic.
For me, it's anything that saves data. I know.
Hard drives, let's get rid of them.
I know, the bad guys, we used to follow bad guys, and if they were really smart, they would just go out on the street in a park and walk and talk, and it was very, very hard to surveil them. We figured out ways to do it and to monitor them, but it was very hard, and they'd stop using phones. They'd start using pay phones, and then back when, does anybody here not remember what a pay phone is? They would do things like this and essentially go off the grid. And I know now when I speak to someone, it may be streaming live on the internet, or I may be overheard. There may be a chance that it's captured in the ether. But when you store a piece of data about yourself, it could be there forever, and anybody can get to it. Anybody, if they know how. That scares me. Anything that saves information on, my DVR scares me. My library has now.
It's just metadata.
I know. Yeah.
Just say it.
Rather than propose my own, I want to kind of riff off both of yours. So the one argument I made about Facebook, and I actually find Facebook a deeply problematic company, but we can talk about why later if you want. But one thing I've said about Facebook in talking to a reporter once was, it saves what used to be evanescent, right? It saves what used to be water cooler chatter. And sure, it's all pretty irrelevant taken singly, but there are kind of nuggets of really, really sensitive stuff there. And when you kind of put it all together, it's also more sensitive than any of the individual parts. That's one of the things that terrifies me about Facebook. Google Now, I've often said, I don't know if I've never used it, so I'm speaking partly from ignorance, but I've responded viscerally to Google's sales pitch, which is, your phone will now tell you when there's traffic on the way to your next meeting. And I thought, that hasn't been a big problem in my life. It's not that hard to check traffic conditions to my next meeting. And if the cost of it is giving more Google engineers my doctor's appointments, no thank you. Like, I know where I am on that. But when you talk to a Google person, they can't imagine a person poo-pooing the idea of your computer warning you that there's traffic on the way to your next meeting. That is like the greatest thing since sliced bread, right?
Right.
Was it you, Brad, who always says sliced bread's actually a really shitty invention? It kind of dries it out.
No, seriously, look at all that surface area, right?
Anyway, okay.
Yeah,
Next question. Why don't we go up on the kind of speaker gallery there? We'll take both of you in turn.
Thank you. So I have three kind of writing prompts for science fiction. The first is the proposal that privacy is dead and that we cling to it because we cling to some out-of-date notion of humanity and the distinction between public and private space. And perhaps we should just embrace our Mark Zuckerberg overlords. The second is that privacy is a commodity. If you can afford privacy, you can have privacy, whether through financial means or through your position in the world. I am a powerful government person, and I can have privacy where, for the rest of you, well, that sucks. Third, riffing off the idea that perhaps we outsource our surveillance or our investigative units in the government. And I hear that that's not likely to happen, but I wonder if surveillance and investigation becomes a boutique commodity that, that we do certain specialized forms of investigation, but then we farm out we farm out the drudge work, to the computers or to people in India who are, simply like looking at this data over and over again, reading it for us. But then there's a few really intelligent people or a few highly skilled people who are still conducting, these certain kinds of investigations that kind of fall through the cracks. So those are just kind of three provocations.
I love how the English professor calls them writing prompts. I'm gonna use that next time. The great provocations. You guys want to jump on any of this?
If it got mentioned earlier, but if you haven't read The Circle, read The Circle. So Sophia, my co-instructor, worked at Google, and she said it's not science fiction. It is what's going on. I mean, they keep track of where you are, who you're talking with, anything that could possibly become corporate-owned information, they will try to retain it. And it's very spooky how much they can collect in the time. So I can't remember who wrote it. Who wrote The Circle? Yeah.
On the second provocation about privacy being something that will only be for the wealthy, I have lots of colleagues who actually are beginning to kind of play with that meme and write op-eds and law review articles about it. I'm of two minds. On the one hand, one of the nice things about kind of entrepreneurship and privacy is it tends to prey on the wealthiest more than the poorest. And so you all know, this is a really bad example of this, but you all know, probably heard about how certain travel sites will charge you more if you're a Mac user than a PC user because they've kind of calculated the perfect price discrimination that they're going to make more money that way. And it turns out lots of services are sold to the wealthy that aren't. The problem is, like everything else in innovation, it's the long tail now that we're starting to kind of squeeze pennies out of. I will say that I've been in conferences where civil rights advocates, race scholars, feminist legal scholars have said, this is such a first world problem. You really should forget about worrying about privacy because everything else is much more important. And my response has always been, at least when it comes to government surveillance, like where are the drones going to fly over first, right? Where are the random stops that shouldn't be occurring, right? So I guess I gave a two-part answer. On the private side, I'm not sure you're right. On the government side, I think that's absolutely right. Anyone else want to respond to any of these?
Oh, I was just mulling over that. I wonder if privacy is a privilege for people with time less than money. It's a kind of privilege, but from what I gather, using Tor, for example, just makes everything really slow. You need to have more time to wait for everything to load, but also just having the time to learn all the tricks of the trade. I don't know. Yeah.
I would say that from the government standpoint of government, and is it futile to have a sense of privacy in light of the existence of our government and where they're headed? I'd say government does exactly what society lets them do, what we fund them to do, and what we essentially ask them to do. Now, it's amazing what can happen when they're kind of left to do what they choose to do. But if society's serious about the policies of privacy being one of them, they can put constraints on government. There are some very good ones on law enforcement. Leave out intelligence for a second. The law enforcement statute that set up to oversee the electronic surveillance laws, wiretaps, for instance, is very, very strong, and it has great incentives for government to restrict its activity. There's civil liabilities to individuals who overrun that. Therefore, there's very few Title IIIs in the United States. If you count them, you find that criminal Title III intercepts are very, very rare. Foreign intelligence intercepts or FISA intercepts, much more common because those same constraints are not there. Now, they can't be exactly the same because they're a different set of interests and a different set of reasons for having them. But as long as society decides they want constraints, they can set effective constraints, and they actually work.
Yeah, but the national intelligence security side is a big
caveat,
right?
There's a gigantic
you can't even learn the facts, save an occasional, slight whistleblower, right? It's hard to. You've got the state secret privilege, which gets these cases kicked out of court on the first week.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I always say, look, at the Justice Department, I worked on the white hat side. I don't know what happened on the dark side. Boy, I've learned a lot in the last year about some of what's happening on the dark side, and I'm a little less sanguine about society being able to rise up and kind of discipline the NSA.
Well, I guess the way I would end the message is just say I'm not going to give up. I wouldn't give up until they get the very last bit of it. It's something I think as a principle we have to you have to hold to. Government will get what it needs to do its job because we empower them to do that. But we should protect and preserve and put kind of weight on the argument that privacy is a part of that. It's important.
Oh, I said the next person on the, but there are about 12 other hands. I'm going to have trouble.
So I do want to deal with the first provocation. Robert Sawyer wrote 2 books, Hominid and Neanderthal, I think. And in those books, there is a world where absolutely everything that you do is recorded all the time. And there's some rules around it, but that's one of the prefaces. And so what I'd like to understand from the panel is, put aside what are kind of your obvious points of view on the ethics of privacy, what if we lived in a world where everything that you did was known, was recorded, was available, everything you thought of, your behaviors, doesn't matter, it's out there. In that world, what changes about social morals, about ethics, about law? How is the world different?
I got an answer again, but I want to let you guys answer.
Well, I'm a subversive, so I'm going to say that at that point, I would just try to generate so much noise that they couldn't find the signal. And I would just do random odd things all the time, right? That's if truly they are going to be able to record and get everything, I am going to throw so much data at them that they'll never find the pattern.
In the hypothetical, I
Yeah.
think in the world with this surveillance system, they're going to win that arms race.
I don't think so. I think I can stay ahead of them. Yeah.
Because you have time.
I know a lot of clowns. I know jugglers. I know you believe me.
When I clerked at the Ninth Circuit, they announced that they were looking for MP3 files transiting the network in the court. So I wrote a Perl script that just took all of my briefs, renamed them something on
Format them and
MP3,
send them on.
and once per minute, just copied them back and forth across the firewall. And so yes, I'm with you in spirit. Others on kind of the world with no privacy, the world with perfect surveillance.
I just don't see how it's possible, but I know that's not the game that you're asking us to play. So,
So legal scholars play this game all the time. And Julie Cohen's quote, which is quoted in every privacy article ever written, is everyone in society would tend to incline toward the bland and mainstream. We kind of would pick one social persona, and we would all become that. You would no longer have a mask with which to experiment, to try to be weird, to try to be crazy. You would chill what you read, what you said, what you spoke. There was a recent survey out from Boston University which interviewed 80 novelists, some of whom were selected because they wrote fiction that some see as subversive, and the vast majority of them have said many times in the last year they have not read something on the web that they would have read because of fear that the NSA would have access to it, including the author of Reading Lolita in Tehran. She was one of the ones who was interviewed and said, I am terrified to read anything on the internet now. Okay, so here's the world we're going to. We've created this wonderful medium, which is the only way we read and consume things now, and the people we most want in our society to be the canaries in the coal mine, to warn us when bad things are coming, the novelists, are no longer willing to kind of exercise their imagination and brains for fear that it might have repercussions and they may be locked up somewhere. That's my biggest fear. There's lots of other ones, but that's my biggest fear, and I'd love it if we could avoid it somehow. I'm not sure how. So, any other thoughts?
I just totally agree that it creates a culture of total, absolute compliance, and that's
Except for Dan.
Except for clowns.
except for clowns. Yeah.
I just want to offer a ray of hope, however. So the ray of hope is LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard with the Privacy Lab. So I suggest you all go and take a look, because they've been building things and doing things which allow you to actually begin to claim back a lot of privacy on the bit.
But she's also really good at breaking what we thought protected privacy.
Well, you know.
Yeah. LaTanya gives and takes. Yes, I agree. Okay, one
there's some
more
hope.
question. Where's the microphone? Why don't you on the aisle? We'll give you the last question of the day. This is. Yes. No pressure. Just take everything everyone else was going to ask and channel it through this one question, the greatest question ever asked.
A unified theory of everything.
We're ready.
Okay. I will pass on the opportunity to do that, but thank you. What I'm wondering is that you're talking about the responsibility of entrepreneurs with privacy and what they owe the consumers, basically, in protecting their privacy. And the thing with that is, like, even if somebody asks me, okay, will you agree to my privacy agreement? Am I going to then say, let me see your terms and conditions, read through the entire thing, understand the entire thing, and then click on that before I go to get this thing that I went on there to get? And you go on the internet to get something really fast. You're not going on there to take your time and make this calculated decision. Well, I don't. I mean, some people maybe do, but at any rate, even if they do provide that option to choose whether or not you allow your privacy to be invaded, how much of a choice do you have? And it goes the same way with communicating. Like, technically, we could just not use the internet. We could not carry smartphones. We could choose to not let people have access to our privacy, but how much of a choice do you have when society runs this way that if you opt out, you don't get access to the things you need to succeed? Like, what do you have to say to that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Sorry, I joked at the beginning. Very, very nice question. Anyone?
I can say something to that. That's the lawyer's fault.
Not in particular.
No. I know we're sitting in a law school, but
First,
that is the most annoying thing. Now, I have known of cases where law enforcement was able to do electronic surveillance without probable cause because of the signature, the signing that someone did that agreed to allow that to happen. You know, it's nuts that we expect people to sign things they can't read and understand and somehow or another give away. That's my opinion.
Right, but the alternative to notice and choice regimes, which is by and large the law in the United States, and it's not really the law in the United States, you don't need a privacy policy. There's no law that says you do unless you're in certain industries. The alternative is Europe, right, which has data protection principles that say things like you can only use data for one purpose and then you have to throw it away. I mean, that's not exactly what it says. And there's some who say that's what we need in the United States. My guess is most of the entrepreneurs in this room would be terrified by that and are much more comfortable with a kind of check the box. I will leave you one of my favorite facts about privacy, which is Carnegie Mellon researchers calculated how much it would cost the American economy if every person read every privacy policy they saw really quickly, skimmed it. $365 billion a year. $1 billion a day it would cost us. So we should all be glad that people like you and me don't read the policies. Any other last thoughts for the day?
I guess all I was thinking is that I think your question sounds almost as if you think society is a machine outside of you that you have no role in, but we're all active, hopefully, members of society. And I do think that we all have the ability to choose, and one has to really take pause when you feel like you don't have a choice. And I think the feeling that you're missing out on something or we're missing out on something is intentionally there to prevent you from becoming an active member. Do you know what does that make sense?
Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, what would it look like if you wanted to say, okay, well, we have the choice to stand up, like if we have the choice to stand up to this invasion of our privacy, how do you actually do that? Like, you can say that, but can you realistically do that?
Right.
Well,
That's what
yeah.
my question is.
Yeah.
And it's similar to like a big issue is like you can sign away your right to sue somebody, sue a company if they do something that is actually incredibly damaging to you. You can sign that away before you ever even see their product, or if you work for somebody. And it's things like that where I could opt out, but then I can't work there.
I mean, just to
Or
be
it's
clear, also,
things like that, you know.
society responses don't have to be legal responses, right? They could be social movements, they could be technologists banding together to create new technologies. I mean, there's lots of other things we can do than pass laws. I like passing laws because I'm a lawyer, but there are other solutions. Okay, lots of hands up. We're up. We're going to go to the reception in a second after Brad says farewell, and I'd love to engage more on this, but please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a high standard. I like to say that often the best conversations around our events occur in the reception to follow. That's going to be a pretty high standard to exceed, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what we come up with. A few things, one of which is the insights of this conference have really, they exceeded my expectations in several dimensions. One is the power of story and the intersection of story, neuroscience, and how science fiction helps us see things that we haven't seen before is a very interesting theme, and I'm interested in doing more on that. Second is injecting ethical considerations into what we do in the innovation community and around technology and startups has been a really interesting discussion. I especially thank this third panel for that. And then third, something that's really come up, I think, especially in Boulder over the last few years is the meaning of our work, ranging from creativity as a core value to what our ambition is in the startup context in which we work, and that was also a thread throughout today. Many thank yous for joining us on really a remarkable day, and look forward to the reception to follow. Enjoy.
You asked a very provocative question, so as soon as you asked that was super fun.